Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you all so much for having me here today. And thank you, Dr. McGuire, for that introduction. I am so excited to be here today to celebrate the work of Margaret Owen. Margaret Owen and I have known each other for 25 years, and I'm going to use our collaboration over those 25 years to highlight what I see as Margaret's greatest contributions to the field. So first, I'd like you to cast your mind back to the year 1998. If you don't remember what 1998 was like, I have a little graphic here that can help you out. So back then, I was on the faculty in the Department of Maternal and Child Health at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. But I'd recently come to the conclusion that it was time to leave Hopkins, and I was really interested in finding a job closer to home where I'd grown up. And around that time, the UT School of Public Health, which is based at UT Houston, was starting a regional campus in Dallas that would be physically located at UT Southwestern. So in terms of location, it was perfect because it was closer to my family. My parents live in Bryan, and I have 3 of my 6 siblings live in the Dallas area. So location was great. The downside was that I wasn't sure if there'd be anybody for me to collaborate with because the School of Public Health's faculty was very small. There wasn't, at least in terms of the Dallas regional campus, and there wasn't really anybody that did my kind of research. So before I took the job, I contacted someone I knew at UT Austin, Aletha Houston, and asked her if she had any recommendations. And she said, oh, you have to meet Margaret Tresch Owen. So I contacted Margaret, and then when my family and I came down in the summer of 1998, I had an appointment to meet Dr. Owen in her office at UT Dallas. There, it's the green building, right? Yes, in the green building, my first visit, but not my last. And, you know, there was this instant connection when we met. It was just that synergy of like-minded scholars who are interested in the same thing. I'm gonna get choked up. So I ended up taking the job largely based on the opportunity to collaborate with Margaret. So now it is 25 years later, believe it or not. And I would like to use my collaboration with Margaret to focus on what I consider her greatest legacy, and that is the importance that she places on relationships. So to Margaret Tresch Owen, relationships are everything. First of all, relationships are fundamental as the building blocks for healthy development for children. But also, for Margaret, relationships are critical for supporting an effective research project, and they're also critical for supporting productive collaborations with other scholars. So the first 6 or 7 years after I moved to Dallas, I still had a number of collaborations going on back in Baltimore. And so the collaborations with Margaret and I were, you know, on a few small projects. However, they really took off in the mid-2000s. And that's where I'm going to focus most of my talk today. So starting in the mid-2000s, Margaret and I got engaged in doing a couple of small pilot studies focused on the normative development of self-regulation. Both she and I are very interested in the socio-emotional foundations of school readiness, and we're also both interested in vulnerable populations. And so after doing a few pilot studies in the early 2000s, we were successful in securing funding from the National Institutes of Health to launch a project that we now call the Dallas Project on Education Pathways. This project is focused on ethnic minority kids, specifically Black and Latino kids living in low-income households. Because although we know that self-regulation is very important for school readiness, most of the data that we had at that time were on majority kids. There was very little data available on self-regulation for ethnic minority kids, for Black and Latino kids, even though those children, especially the ones that are living in low-income households, are the ones who are at greatest risk for early academic failure. Wrong way. So self-regulation really is foundational to school readiness, and a recognition of that fact was really gaining prominence in the early 2000s. Any kindergarten teacher can tell you that managing a classroom of kindergartners, that, you know, the most important factor is the children's self-regulation or lack of self-regulation. And so some have said that managing a kindergarten classroom is kind of like trying to keep crickets in a basket, or in this case, keeping kittens in a bowl. So why is self-regulation so important for school readiness? Well, it just makes sense. Think about a child's ability to control their impulses so they're not poking at their neighbor, their ability to listen to their teacher and follow directions, their ability to shift attention, all of that is critical to their ability to learn during those early years. We know that self-regulation starts developing rapidly around the age of 2, which is concurrent with the development of the brain areas, specifically the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat for higher-ordered thought and problem solving. But by the time children get to kindergarten, there's a wide range of individual differences in their abilities to regulate their behavior. Some of that's driven by just individual differences in children themselves, but it's also related to differences in their environments, particularly the relationships with their parents. As I mentioned, there was very little data available at that time on marginalized populations. And so Margaret and I were interested in examining normative self-regulation in these Black and Latino children who were living in low-income families, and how that self-regulation was shaped by their relationship with their parents, and then how it was related to their early academic success. So as part of DPREP, we followed children from when they were 2.5 years old until they were 12 and 13. And the original sample were all located in Dallas County. Of course, over time, they moved all over the place. Most of them stayed in Dallas-Fort Worth. We did have families that moved out of the area and out of state. But we did continue to try to follow families if we could, even if they left the area. So we had a total of 8 different data points of data collection. 4 of those were during early childhood and early elementary school, and then 4 times starting in 4th grade through 7th grade. We enrolled a total of 407 families. Slightly more than half of those families are Latino. And of those Latino families, the majority of them were Spanish speaking and had a primary caregiver who was born outside the United States. And for the sample overall, for all the families in the DPREP study, about 2/3 of them were living in households with an annual income that was below 100% of the federal poverty level. So this is a snapshot of the data that we collected as part of DPREP. We used a whole wide range of different methods of data collection, including self-report, because we did interviews with caregivers, and we also did interviews with the children once they were old enough to report on their own. We did direct observations of parent-child relationships and also direct assessments of the children. We also collected a wide range of domains, including some kind of standard domains like academic achievement and parent-child relationships, and behavioral adjustment. But we also collected data on areas that are uniquely important for the development of children of color, specifically ethnic racial socialization, their experiences of racism and discrimination, and their ethnic identity development. And finally, we also obtained data from the Texas Education Agency on the schools that DPREP children attended, including their economic characteristics, their racial composition, and their school effectiveness. So we were very successful in retaining families. Across the first 4 waves of data collection, our retention rates were around 90%, which is a rate that's virtually unheard of in longitudinal studies, particularly longitudinal studies of families that are experiencing economic stress, such as the families in our study. Starting in wave 5, we implemented something called a planned missing design, which means that at any individual time point, we only target a subset of families for data collection. But even, so this is, through the age of 12 to 13, our completion rates were around 80%. And so this highlights one of the first principles that Margaret instilled in us in terms of the importance of relationships. And that was the importance of the individuals that we involved in the study. So we hired 2 women from the community, Plastella Arnold and Carmen Gonzalez, who are both here today. And I'd like you to stand up. Class, like, no, thank you. That's Carmen. Come on, class. So Class and Carmen are very well connected in their communities, and they were the point person for recruiting families, for scheduling home visits, and for interviewing the caregivers. And it was really the relationships that they were able to create to establish with the families in the study that was critical to the families maintaining their participation in the study. And even though Carmen had to leave us after, I think, 3 or 4 waves, Platts was with us through the entire study. So she was with us when we recruited families starting in 2009, all the way through wave 8, which ended in 2021. Indeed, there were some families in the study who had such a close relationship to Platts that they would not do the interview with anybody but her. And so we had to be very mindful of that if we wanted to keep the families engaged. Margaret and I were also very committed to having strong relationships in our research teams. Both in terms of like within team as well as across team between the University of Texas at Dallas and the University of Georgia when I moved there in 2016. As you can imagine, it takes a lot of people to pull off a project like DPREP. You need people to contact families, to schedule and track them over time, to conduct the interviews. You need people to conduct assessments, and you need people to process data. So as part of DPREP, we had a whole army of research assistants. The other thing that was very important to Margaret and I is that we both recognized that the fact that we were white, both of us are white individuals, and we were conducting a research project focused on Black and Latinx families, that we both very likely had blind spots when it came to understanding the lived experiences of children of color and families of color. And so it was very important to us to have racially diverse research teams because we relied on their input in terms of the data collection process, the data collection tools, and also in terms of the interpretation of data. So what did we find? In terms of the normative development of self-regulation, what we see is what you expect in the larger literature. So here we have the development of inhibitory control, which is one of the earliest self-regulation skills to come online. And we used a task called snack delay to assess their inhibitory control, which involves putting an M&M in front of them and asking them not to touch the M&M for anywhere from 10 seconds to 30 seconds. You may have heard, how many people have heard of the marshmallow task? Yes. So the marshmallow task, which is a delay of gratification task, is used when children are older. And basically in the marshmallow task, a child is presented with a group like 3 large marshmallows. And they're told, if you can wait for 7 minutes, then you can have all 3 marshmallows. If you can't wait, just ring this bell, let me know, and you can have 1 marshmallow. So you do that when children are more like 5 or 6, and not with 2.5-year-olds. So with 2.5-year-old, we just have 1 M&M in front of them and ask them to wait anywhere from 10 seconds to 30 seconds. And when we started at 2.5, you can see that the vast majority of the kids, they cannot wait even. We had some kids ring the bell themselves so they can take the M&M. But you can see that over time, by the time you see a rapid increase in their ability to inhibit their behavior by the time they are 3.5. And this is consistent with what we would expect because of the rapid development of the brain that's occurring at this time. You see a great increase in inhibitory control during early childhood. So the next self-regulation skill that develops after inhibitory control is what we call cognitive flexibility. And so this is the ability to shift attention from one thing to another. The way that we tested cognitive flexibility is with a task called head, toes, knees, and shoulders, which is very similar to the game red light, green light that you may have played or your kids may play, where basically kids are required to do the opposite of what they're being told. So in head, toes, knees, and shoulders, when the child is asked to touch their head, they have to touch their toes. And when they're asked to touch their toes, they have to touch their heads. And you can see here, that's first grade gray bar. That's at age 3.5. And basically at 3.5, they can't do it. They basically do what they're told, not the opposite of what they're told. But the yellow bar, which is when they're in kindergarten, most of them, and the green bars when most of them are in first grade, you can see again a rapid increase so that by the time they get to school, that a lot of them can display fairly high levels of cognitive flexibility. We also see different patterns of growth in self-regulation over early childhood, so that not all children display the same average path of development. And this is based on the master's work of Daniel Pacheco. Danny, you want to wave your hands? Yay. So these are different patterns of growth between time one, which is when children are 2.5, to when their children are 3.5, 1 year later. And so that top line, which is about 12% of children, these are children who seem to have acquired the ability to inhibit their behavior at an unnaturally young age. You know, there are children like that in every group, right? So even at 2.5, they're able to not take the M&M when they're asked not to. The second line, the black line, that's what we call the normative group. So these are kids who couldn't do it at 2.5, but you can see they develop the skill rapidly so that by 3.5 they can. And then finally, we have the bottom line, which is the dashed line. And those are the groups of children who seem to be lagging behind in their inhibitory control. We see similar patterns in different patterns of growth in cognitive flexibility. So these data go over a broader age range. So they range from when children are about 4.5 until they're about 7. This also includes not only data from DPREP, but also from a number of other studies around the country. But again, you see very similar patterns. You see the same 3 groups. So you have that top group, which are groups of that white dotted line. And those are the children who seem to have acquired cognitive flexibility at a younger age than you would expect. And then you have that yellow dashed line, which is about 40% of the kids. Those are the kids who couldn't do it initially, but seem to have developed that skill by the time they get to elementary school. And then finally, you have the bottom line, which tends to roughly encompass about 19 to 20%, not just in this sample, but in other samples as well, who are the children who, when they enter, who seem to be lagging behind in their cognitive flexibility skills and seem to be lagging behind when they enter school. So we also found that self-regulation was important for academic achievement, which is what is reported in the broader literature. Specifically, we found that children who have higher levels of inhibitory control during early childhood showed faster growth in their mathematics skills from kindergarten to 1st grade. And also children who showed faster growth in inhibitory control over early childhood showed faster growth in math from kindergarten to 1st. And finally, children who showed faster growth in cognitive flexibility showed faster growth in reading from kindergarten to 1st grade. We also found that inhibitory control was important for reading growth, but it appeared to differ depending upon the school that the child attended. So what we found is that if a child entered kindergarten with poor inhibitory control skills, but they attended a high quality school, they displayed the same level of growth in reading from kindergarten to 1st grade. In contrast, if you had a child who had poor inhibitory control skills and attended a low quality school, then they showed slower growth in their reading from kindergarten to 1st grade. So this shows you that the context matters, particularly the context of the school. And it may be particularly important for more vulnerable children. So in this case, children who enter school with poor self-regulation skills. We also know that relationships with parents are important for self-regulation skills because there's an abundance of research that's demonstrated that children who experience supportive parenting during early childhood show better self-regulation skills. And Margaret Owen is a pioneer in developing the methods that we use in research for quantifying the quality of the parent-child relationships. This approach uses a structured play activity in which a parent-child dyad is provided with a standard set of books and toys and are told to play with those toys in any way that they want for about 15 minutes. And during that time, the interaction is video recorded, and then later we code them for a range of different parent behaviors and child behaviors. And so we use this approach in DPREP to examine the relationships between the children and their parents. And we used it both between the children and their mothers, as well as the children with their fathers. So one thing we found is that there are certain aspects of parenting which are universal. And you can see this in our DPREP families. When the children were 2.5, we saw high levels of child-oriented parenting, both for the Latino parents as well as the African American parents, and for the mothers as well as the fathers. We also found similar relationships between parenting during early childhood and children's school readiness that you would see in the larger literature. In these African American Latino families, specifically, children who experience more supportive parenting during early childhood showed better academic achievement when they got to school, fewer behavior problems, and better self-regulation. We were also able to document the important role of fathers in the lives of these African American and Latino children. So in the broader literature, fathers are often characterized as being different from mothers in a number of ways in terms of how they interact with their children. So they'd be characterized as being more likely to engage in physical or rough and tumble play and to encourage risk-taking. However, when we compared the behaviors of mothers and fathers in DPREP, at least in terms of the standard metrics, we saw very high levels of sensitivity and support for our fathers, similar to what we saw in our mothers. However, despite overwhelming similarities in the behavior of mothers and fathers in the study, we also found differences in how mothering and fathering during early childhood, at least for these African American Latino children, was related to their developmental outcomes. So, for example, we found that supportive mothering during early childhood was associated with better inhibitory control, whereas supportive fathering was associated with better cognitive flexibility. However, this relationship was specific for African American families. So African American children who experienced more supportive fathering showed better cognitive flexibility development, but we did not see that relationship for the Latino father-child dyads. Likewise, we found differences in the relationship between mothering and fathering in early childhood and their academic achievement. We found that sensitive mothering during early childhood was associated with better reading achievement for the children when they got to kindergarten, but sensitive fathering was associated with better mathematics achievement. So, of course, that raises the whole question as to why. So clearly, the father-child relationship is just as important to the development of these African American and Latino children as the mother-child relationship is, but it appears to be important in different ways. And so we want to know, why is it important in different ways? So one of the first things we did was to investigate whether there were differences in father-child involvement, and that did not explain the differences. We also investigated whether there were differences in father behavior that we weren't capturing with those standard measures that we were using. So we went back to the videos and tried to rate them for a whole range of other different of father behaviors, and we didn't find anything that explained the differences that we thought we would see. So currently, what we're investigating is the possibility that there are differences in father language. And because we have videos, we are able to go back, and we are in the process of transcribing all the videos of the mothers with their children and the fathers with their children. So we can look at whether or not are there differences in the amount of language, are there differences in the kind of language, are there differences in how they use language between mothers and fathers that might explain why we see these differences in the relationship between early mothering and fathering and children's outcomes when they get to school. But we're not quite there yet. We're still in the process of transcribing lots and lots of data. So Margaret and I both consider it very important that parent-child relationships be considered within cultural context. I'm sure you're all familiar with Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model, which considers child development to develop within nested contexts that range from the more proximal, such as their family relationships, to the more distal, such as things happening in the larger society. So there have been several adaptations of Bronfenbrenner's ecosystem model that focus more on children of color. This particular model on the screen was recently proposed by Stern and colleagues, and it focuses on the contexts affecting the development of Black children. So some of those factors are very similar to what are important for all children, such as relationships with parents and relationships with teachers. But there are also some factors which are unique that include things like experiences of racism and discrimination. Now, although this model is specifically focused on Black children, you can also imagine a model specifically to Latino children. Some of those factors will be similar to what is uniquely important for Black children, such as experiences of discrimination, but there are also some factors which are unique, such as issues related to immigration, issues related to language use, and also acculturation. For Margaret and I, as I mentioned, as white researchers studying African American and Latino children, we both considered it very critically important that we include scholars of color on our research team. So some of these individuals are former students or postdocs, and others are more senior scholars that we invited to collaborate with us as either co-investigators or as consultants. It's important to know that this process is not a one and done process. It's not enough just to invite scholars of color to be on your research team. It's very important to build trust in those relationships, and also for Margaret and I to be cognizant of our limits in understanding the lived experiences of families of color and deferring to our scholars, these scholars of color, as our collaborators whenever we needed to. One of the aspects of parenting that's unique to families of color is the process of what's called ethnic racial socialization, or ERS. And ERS is what parents of color do to support the healthy development of their children when they're trying to raise them in a larger society that often devalues people of color. ERS is usually considered to occur within 3 different domains. The first is cultural socialization, which are the things that parents do to increase their child's pride in their ethnic group, such as teaching their child their group's history or taking their child to cultural events or other celebrations. The second is preparation for bias. And those are the things that parents do to increase their child's awareness of racism and discrimination, and also to help them develop strategies for coping with those experiences. And finally, there's promotion of mistrust, which focuses more explicitly on the inequities in society and emphasizes the need to avoid interactions with other race ethnic groups. So we started collecting parents' reports of ERS when the children were 2.5, and we repeated it every time point until the children were 12 and 13 years old. So as far as I know, DPREP is the only study that started collecting ERS data longitudinally at such a young age. And so we are in a unique position to examine how these socialization practices emerge and how they're related to children's outcomes. So what we found is that cultural socialization emerges at the youngest ages, and that it is related to better children's outcomes, just like we see it related to better children's outcomes at older ages. So parents who engaged in cultural socialization when children were 2.5 had children who showed better school readiness 1 year later. So they had better pre-academic scores, better language development, and fewer behavior problems. Now, socialization around preparation for bias starts a little bit later than cultural socialization. So here you have the proportion of parents that engaged in preparation for bias at each age, starting the purple bars at age 2.5, and the green bar at the lime green bar at the far side is at 12 and 13. And so you can see that when the kids were 2.5 to 3.5, 20% or less, not very many were providing any preparation for bias. But you can see that as children moved into school, which is that lavender bar, that is when a lot of preparation for bias seems to come online, and that's when children are moving into kindergarten. And that was particularly true amongst our African American families. So the African American families really ramped up their preparation for bias once children moved into school. We did see similar increases amongst our Latino families, but not to the same degree that we saw in the African American families. So there must be something about the school environment for Black children that is cause for their parents to start ramping up the support they provide their children for coping with discrimination. So when we were in the middle of data collection for DPREP, I had an opportunity to hear a talk given by Dr. Mia Smith-Bynum of the University of Maryland that completely turned my conceptualization of ERS on its head. So Dr. Smith-Bynum pioneered observational methods for studying ERS, which gave us an opportunity to examine how ERS functioned within the larger parent-child relationship. She designed something called the Racial Socialization Observation Task, or the RSOT, which involves 3 different vignettes the child and parent listen to of a child experiencing a racist experience in 3 different settings, and then the child is asked to discuss how they would handle it if it had happened to them. Now, Dr. Smith-Bynum did her initial work with Black 15 and 16-year-olds and their parents. And so we invited her to work with us to adapt her vignettes so they would be appropriate for the 10 and 11-year-olds in our study and also for Latino children. And so we ended up using 3 vignettes. First, there's a school counselor vignette in which you have an academically motivated child who approaches the school counselor and asks to be transferred into the advanced science class, and then is told by the counselor that children like them don't belong in the advanced science class. The second vignette was about an encounter with a police officer out in the community in which the child is asked why they're there and whether or not they belong there. And finally, the store clerk vignette was slightly different for the Black children and the Latino children in the sample. So for the Black children, it involved being followed around a store by a clerk and being questioned as to why they were there. And for the Latino children, it was a language brokering vignette in which a clerk is saying negative things about Latinos, and the child who's there with their mother, but their mother doesn't speak English, has to figure out, how much they tell their mother about what's going on. Now we ended up so we did the RSOT with 81 of the children from DPREP. That was relatively evenly split between the Black and Latino families. And then we ended up having to modify the coding system that Dr. Mia Smith-Bynum had developed, because she had originally done the work with 15 and 16-year-olds. And what we found when we watched the videos with 10 and 11-year-olds, that there were things that emerged in what parents did and what children did that were different, what you would expect, because 10 and 11-year-olds are different developmentally, and particularly in terms of their understanding of racism and discrimination. So we had a large team of both undergraduate and graduate students who were African American and Latino who helped us to modify the coding system and then decode the videos. So first I'm going to focus on parents and children's conversations about the racist counselor vignette. And what we found is that parents generally fell into 3 general profiles of how they dealt with this situation. It's important to note that in all 3 groups, the parents were very supportive. It's just that they expressed their support in different ways. So the first group, the parents were very focused on scaffolding their child's understanding of racism and discrimination and naming it as racist, and also discussing the larger societal forces, both historical and current, that contribute to discrimination, something we refer to as critical consciousness raising. The second group, they also discussed racism, but to a lesser extent than the first group, and they primarily focused on actively advocating for their children, and also ensuring their child's emotional well-being. And the third group put much less emphasis on awareness of racism and focused rather on the child's need to show respect for authority. And what we found is that children whose parents fell into the third group showed higher levels of academic engagement. Now turning to the vignette with a police officer, there was, again, similarities in the parents' approaches to it. We had the first group, which was similar to the counselor vignette in terms of emphasizing identifying racism and critical consciousness raising. The second group was more moderate in critical consciousness raising and focused more on providing coping suggestions and also expressing concerns for the child's safety. And then the third group de-emphasized critical consciousness raising and rather focused on helping the child to identify coping strategies. Now, how this played out for children depended upon the characteristics of the child. We found that when children had self-regulation skills in the normative group, it was best if they had a parent who was in the first group, one that emphasized critical consciousness raising. And if they were in that group, they showed fewer internalizing problems. However, if you had a child with low self-regulation skills, it was better for them to have a parent in the third group. So a parent who did not emphasize critical consciousness raising and rather focused on identifying coping strategies, those children had fewer internalizing problems. So this is consistent with Dr. Smith-Bynum's theory that ERS needs to be matched to the child's needs. And you may be familiar because we often talk about the importance of goodness of fit between parenting and a child's needs. As important as ethnic racial socialization is, it doesn't capture fully how parenting is shaped by cultural context. And unfortunately, the methods that we've used in developmental science for so long have a tendency to cast minoritized parents in a negative light. So for example, measures of parenting styles often overclassify African American parents as authoritarian. Some of the observational methods that we often use have a tendency to rate African American and Latino parents as more intrusive and to rate African American parents as lower in warmth. The problem is that these methods don't take into account how different culturally anchored parenting priorities are reflected in differences in parent behavior. So for example, differences in the priorities that parents place on parental directiveness, or cultural differences in expectations regarding emotional expressiveness. Unfortunately, the methods that we have been using for decades in developmental science were first developed with predominantly white samples of parents and children. So if white parents and children are used to define the frame through which we understand parenting, and then you take that frame and you transpose it onto minoritized families, then it's very likely that you're going to miss important aspects of the parent-child relationship that don't fall inside that frame that was defined by within white families. So Margaret and I decided to try to address this by bringing together a diverse set of scholars who were experts in early child development and parenting in diverse populations. And we set upon a task of reviewing the videos that we had of the parent-child relationship from DPREP to see if we could identify aspects of their interactions that weren't captured by the standard methods that we've been using. So first, we focused on the Latino mothers in DPREP, specifically focusing on those who had been born outside of the United States and who spoke predominantly Spanish. But we spent some time with our team collectively watching those videos, as I said, to see if we could find something that wasn't being captured. And we did detect a characteristic parent-child interaction that was going to be characterized by a high level of directiveness on the part of mothers, coupled with a high level of positive affect and compliance on the part of the child. We saw this as a behavioral manifestation of the Latino cultural values of respeto and familism. And so we used those to define two new rating items, one for parents that we called parent calm authority, and one for children called child affinity for obedience. And you can see on the slide the different aspects of those parent and child behaviors that fell underneath those two new rating items. What we found was that high levels of parent calm authority also clustered with other positive maternal behaviors, such as high levels of maternal warmth and support. However, it wasn't redundant of those measures, because we found that high levels of parental calm authority were associated uniquely with children's growth of language skills during early childhood. We've also attempted to do something similar with the African American families in our study. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that African American parenting is characterized as being no nonsense. So when you think about having a higher number of Black parents being characterized as authoritarian, that seems to make sense. Although the literature also shows that authoritarian parenting doesn't predict child outcomes. So in white families, authoritarian parenting is negative. In Black families, authoritarian parenting is associated with better youth outcomes. Even though people recognize that there are these differences in no-nonsense parenting, no one has ever tried to operationalize no-nonsense parenting in terms of observations of African-American parents interacting with their young children. And so we articulated a new rating item to capture no-nonsense parenting that we call active direction. So we're still in the early stages of studying active direction, but I can tell you a few things. First of all, it does characterize the African-American families in our study and not the Latino families in our study. So we see relatively high levels of active direction in the African-American mothers and fathers, and virtually no active direction in Latino mothers and fathers. And we also find that it's associated with a number of other positive parenting behaviors, including higher levels of cognitive stimulation, scaffolding, and parent calm authority. So finally, I would like to focus on the work of a couple of my students, which I think highlight the importance of relationships between schools and minoritized parents. Both of these students are interested in how Black parents specifically and their children navigate the school system. First, there's Keela Allen, who's one of my doctoral students who recently completed her master's thesis focused on parents' involvement in school, particularly during kindergarten and elementary school. As she documented in her thesis, Black parents are often stereotyped as not being involved in their children's schooling. But these stereotypes ignore the academically and culturally relevant practices that African American parents engage in outside of school to support their children's school success. It also ignores how schools themselves may create barriers to Black parents' involvement in school. So Keeley used data from DPREP's wave 3 and 4, which is kindergarten and first grade, to examine how teacher relationships and school factors impacted the engagement of the involvement of Black parents in school. And what she found was that when Black parents had better relationships with their children's teacher, that they were more involved in school. And also when their children attended schools that had higher levels of racial equity. And by racial equity, I mean that the school was successful in serving the needs of all children and either reducing or eliminating disparities in Black and white children's academic achievement, that those parents were also more involved in school. And finally, there's Nakia Pinson, who's one of my doctoral students, who's interested in how Black parents' ethnic racial socialization changes as children move into middle school and whether those changes are influenced by school context. You might recall from an earlier slide that ethnic racial socialization in Black parents increases as children move into middle school. But what Nakia found is that it's moderated by the ethnic composition of the school's teachers and by the child's gender. Specifically, cultural socialization seems to be higher for Black boys in middle school relative to Black girls, but only when Black boys are attending a middle school with fewer Black teachers. Now, unfortunately, the data that we have on school characteristics is not nuanced enough for us to be able to tease apart why this is. But there must be something about relationships that Black parents have with the teachers in their school, that when there are more Black teachers at school, that they feel more comfortable stepping back a little bit when it comes to the cultural socialization of their boys. So now I'm bringing you to the end of our journey through 25 years of collaboration with Margaret Owen. It's hard to believe it's been 25 years, and there's no question that this collaboration has been the most meaningful of my life. Trying to boil this down, 25 years into 40 minutes, very difficult. But I kept coming back to the concept of relationships, because relationships are the essence of Margaret Owen's legacy. First of all, studying relationships is the core of her research, particularly studying the parent-child relationship. And her contributions in that research field are legend. But that's not the only place where her contribution has been critical with regards to relationships. She's very focused on creating supportive relationships with her students, with her colleagues, and also with community members, and also with collaborators like me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. That was so interesting. I'm wondering about a finding you showed on parents' racial socialization strategies and how that linked to kids' outcomes. I think it was that paper.
Yes.
And the first effect you showed was that when the counselor told the child to, that space isn't for you, and then parents said respect authority, I guess all in line, that was associated with higher academic achievement. Can you give us your reflections on that? Is that at the expense of good self-esteem, or what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that result kind of bothered me as well. Margaret, do you have a thought? Or you can raise your hand.
No, I'm acting the same way you did.
Yeah. I mean, there may be things at so that's engagement at one time point, right? So we don't know how things will change over time. We know that kids' engagement, so the RSOT was done when the kids were in 5th grade, and we know as kids move into middle school, their engagement declines. We don't know the extent to which it just meant that it was keeping them from declining faster, but then maybe they declined later. I know I have another student whose work I didn't report, who looked at longitudinal changes in kids before and after, in their engagement before and after transition to middle school, and having a positive school climate. She was focused on the Black children in the study. A positive school climate kept their skills from their engagement from declining. So I think it's just one factor in many, but yeah.
I mean, the other thought that I had, although you see less of the aspects of ethnic racial socialization that you think should be very positive and lead to positive outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds, oh, that's not very good. Just fall in line and do what you're told. But you don't know what else is associated with that aspect of their discussion of this little vignette. And also, let's go back to, what is the relationship like in other arenas for that child? So there's a lot we don't know by just focusing on what was said in that interaction. And follow the rules is not a bad thing to tell your children, And if you go off in talking about how horrendous this situation is, that could also drive disengagement. Okay, I'm not going to have anything to do with that person, that counselor, or anything that anybody tells me here because I reject it, because we're talking about how bad this is. So
Well,
I think it's very nuanced.
It's very, and the other thing that unfortunately, so those analyses focus just on what the profiles of what parents did, but it didn't really incorporate what children did. And so we do have some other analyses that look at that, but it's complicated because I wish we had something that looked at the issue of goodness of fit like we do with the police vignette. So for example, maybe that is moderated by how the child is responding to that situation as well.
And there are aspects too of the ways in which they are conveying this information. I mean, you've got parents lecturing at their kids about this situation. The child has no input. It's not focused on our relationship. But let me tell you what you need to be doing. And that's important too. There's so much more to learn from this.
I know, it was interesting that when I first met Dr. Smith-Bynum and heard that talk, I still remember it because it's like, Margaret and I had been studying the parent-child relationship, right, over here. We're also collecting ERS data over here. And I'm listening to Margaret, to Dr. Smith-Bynum, it's like, it's like ERS happens within the context of that relationship. So we ended up kind of pivoting. We were supposed to collect different parent-child data, interaction data, and we just pivoted and did the RSOT instead. But there's so much data.
And except for Smith-Bynum, and then now us, ethnic racial socialization is studied with a questionnaire. And so we wanted to see it in action as she was doing. Again, we have younger kids, so we're going to figure out how to do it with younger kids.
Yeah. And there've been people, there's a student who's a doctoral student in psychology who's been in our lab, and she did her master's thesis. She did a microcoding just for the Latino, so about the 40 kids that were in the Latino sample. So she did microcoding and then just sequential analysis on the child side to see how parents were like, if the child, one of the things we found that there were differences between children in terms of whether or not they acknowledged or identified it as the situation as being racist. And so we looked at like how parents responded when their child did. I mean, I think by the time kids get to 15 and 16, they pretty readily recognize it, but at 10 or 11, not so much. So I think there's this issue of goodness of fit is really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. This is really interesting. One of the things I'm really curious about is those trajectories of self-regulation skills. So you have the kids who start off surprisingly high,
Yes.
the kids who improved just slightly, and then the kids who improved a lot, or the more normative, I guess.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how much you think those trajectories can be shifted by parenting or by other kinds of interventions.
Well, yes. So it's funny you should ask that because, one of the things that always happens when you collect data this and you have a longitudinal study, right? So we have direct assessment of children's self-regulation skills from 2.5 up through about the age of 11 or 12, like wave 7. We weren't able to get direct assessment of self-regulation at wave 8 because of COVID, right? But we have a lot of data, and then the measures change over time. And so we actually have been trying to model that trajectory from 2.5 up through age 12. And that took forever with, with statisticians that I can't even tell you. Like, so that was one huge process, which we completed and actually have a paper in revision on that. And now the next step is to try to take those that, how you model it over time and try to do like a growth mixture modeling or something that looks at whether or not there are different patterns of growth from early child to, because inhibitory control should be relative, both of them should be, they're not sealing out necessarily. We know that the prefrontal cortex continues to develop until the mid-20s, right? But we haven't gotten to the point yet where we can look at kind of different profiles. Yeah. So stay tuned, I guess.
Well, I was just thinking, that'd be great for you to speak to, but I was wondering, Adriana could say a thing or two about our Play With Me, which all of you have had experience in, our Play With Me program. There's a lot of things that we're doing to try to help the children that we're serving who come into that program. They look very different at the beginning of the 12 weeks, and it's chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of little games that help to nurture, right? And support their developing self-regulation. These kids have not had.
Well, there are intervention studies like Tools of the Mind and some of Karen Bierman's work on add-ons to Head Start focus on improving kids' self-regulation skills.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm real happy about Play With Me.
Yeah. Good question back there.
Yes, so you mentioned that if you have a sensitive mother, then that leads to better reading outcomes, but then if you have a sensitive father, that leads to better math outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Were all of the children from 2-parent households? And if not, did you see that the children who say didn't have a father, how were their math outcomes?
Trying to remember. I mean, we did the analysis with all the mothers, right? So, but I'm trying to wonder if
I don't know that we looked at whether there was a father in the household. And it's not that they don't have fathers, but we only observed father-child interactions if father was living in the same household. And,
right.
Fathers are influencing their kids, whether or not they're living in
So
the household to greater or lesser.
Right. So we did not attempt to collect father-child interaction data if the father was not co-resident, just because of the complication. I know some individuals I have some colleagues who are doing that. So I'd have to go back and look at the analysis because I remember we had to do some fancy missing data sorts of things, which I don't even remember now.
But you can help us look at that, okay?
Yeah.
And think of that. I mean,
Yes.
usually these findings are, okay, that leads to another question. How are we going to address that?
Yes.
How can we understand that? As Margaret
Yes.
talked about, there's a lot of things we don't understand about our findings, and we keep probing.
Yeah. We have a lot of data.
I had a question about the sample population, and if y'all looked at just completely African American children versus multiracial, because I was just curious on if you would see differences between those racial ethnic socialization practices, and then also the conversations that those parents had with their multiracial children. Being a multiracial child, I know.
Yes, I think that the issues of ethnic racial socialization for multiracial kids is an area of research that's really ripe for needing better study. As a matter of fact, when the doctoral student I mentioned, Nakia Pinson, when she first joined the lab, she is very interested in multiracial children's ethnic identity development, which of course is unrelated to the ethnic racial socialization because her kids are multiracial. And so she did a lot of kind of preliminary work, was going to do some qualitative work. And unfortunately, like our sample, we do, I think there's what, 15% of the African American kids are multiracial, multi-ethnic. I don't know out of the RSOT how many are, right? But we don't have sufficient power to really look at it. I know that the student who did the profile analysis, that she would often break out the multiracial, multi-ethnic kids, but even then, it's really not. I struggle with this because, if you get a child whose father is just African American, their mother is just African American, then it's almost like you think you have like a pure measure. But that also, that the more you do that, the less you actually represent the lived experiences of all children of color in this country, because the number of multi-ethnic, multiracial children is increasing. But I think our study we just don't have enough data. Yeah.
Oh, hi. I'm currently looking at, with my research project, looking at how to make meaningful experiences for different families and different backgrounds and everything. And I really want to know how you were able to retain these families for such a long period of time, especially since they moved around that much. I was really impressed by the retention percentage and everything.
Well, I'm wondering if, hey, class, you want to answer that question?
We established a relationship with the families.
And what did that mean for you?
For me, it meant trust. They trusted me to say to do what I said I was going to do. They knew I didn't have any ill intent. So it was just trust. When people trust you, they tell you all their business. They told all their business.
Thank you.
So it was really hiring people who know the community. Because similarly, Carmen, knows the Latino families in Dallas very well. She's been around for a long time and has good relationships with those families. And it's a slightly different model than a lot of developmental scientists tend to use. Your graduate students to go out and recruit and do data collection. And we hired people from the community to do that. And it was important for us to listen to what Carmen and class told us about. Early on, we had some measures that weren't functioning well. There were measures that were taking too long, or the families were responding in ways that were not ideal. We had measures, I remember some measures early on, I don't know if Carmen remembers this, where, there were differences, even though we had, forward and back, where we gotten measures that were already in Spanish, and then we did, forward and backward translation, all that sort of stuff. All the stuff that the researchers studied to do. And then there were things, though, that they were not consistent with local idiomatic Spanish, and so we had to change those, or they just didn't, there were just things that didn't function well in those communities, and so we had to be willing to hear those messages and pivot, and that can be a challenge, because you have to balance making it appropriate, but also maintaining scientific integrity, whatever that is. So. But they're critically important members of our research team.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I have a clarification question, I guess, about those trajectories. So you had those three separate groups of children that would track high, middle, or normative and low.
Yes.
Was it typical for them to be in the same group across scales, or is it all dependent on the parenting?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know if we have, are you asking whether the kids in the high, middle, and low cognitive flexibility group are in the same high, middle? That's a good question. I don't know. Danny, do we ever cross-tab those data? Now, full disclosure, the cognitive flexibility, those data are specifically focused on Latino kids. Yeah. So that it doesn't include the African American kids, so that we were combining data from a bunch of different Latino samples around the country. But we could still take the Latino kids and see whether the groups they fell in for the groups that Danny identified for inhibitor control was similar. I don't know.
Thank you.
Good question. See, more answers means more questions.
We never actually did that work. We never went to the next to that step in digital cross measure. And we actually had a lot of challenges just getting those profiles to merge the way that we do. But no, that would be a really nice natural next step.
I work in the early childhood intervention, and it's just making me sit here and think about how can we apply this learning to helping our children and families, the 0 to 3 population. And we do group sessions with our children where we bring the parents and children together to do group activities. But are you working, or is anybody working on specific intervention strategies that we can do with these little ones so that we promote these characteristics before they graduate from ECI?
I mean, so on a couple of domains, yes, on the self-regulation skills, I know that Margaret, y'all do some of this in Play With Me, and there's other interventions, some based in Head Start, some not, that they have different tasks that you can teach parents to do with their kids. And interestingly, with regards to ethnic racial socialization, I am collaborating, I'm a mentor for a woman who is, her name is Ashanta Anderson, and she's a pediatrician at the University of Southern California. And she's very interested in cultural pride socialization in early childhood. And so she is actually doing a randomized trial with a book intervention. So I'm sure you're familiar with Reach Out and Read. So it builds upon Reach Out and Read, but it uses books that parents of color can, and she's focusing on African American parents, can use with their young children to help them to develop the skills to support cultural socialization and cultural pride reinforcement. So, yeah.
Have a new area of interest now.
Oh, good.
Was figuring out what we can do
Well, and
with our babies.
yeah, if you want to, be in contact with me and I can connect you with Dr. Anderson, be happy to.
Okay, if there's no other questions, we're gonna say thank you so much to Dr. Caughy for